So, the divided line, I would say the most difficult part of the book to grasp. And in some sense, I don't care if we fully understand this material. It would take, I'm not sure that I fully understand this material. I'm talking about what begins on page 200 and then, continues to the end of book 6. And he says some stuff that's really at the heart of Platonic philosophy, or at least the metaphysical part of Platonic philosophy, the theory of reality. But maybe it's not so important to follow every step as to really see what emerges at the end of it. But in any case, this discussion I think really gets started at the bottom of page 200, and this is in the context of thinking about who the philosopher is, and further justifying the rule in this perfect imaginary city of the philosophers over the rest. And the idea is that if we want our city to be just and good, the people who make its laws and rule over the city should have the best conception of what is truly just and good. And Socrates is thinking, well, if they know the form of justice, remember that perfect, intelligible form of justice, and they're like painters. When they create the city, or when they make the city's laws and rule the city, they're like painters who are looking at the real thing, and then looking at the canvas, looking at the real thing, looking at the canvas. The guardians, the philosophers, are looking as much as they can at the real thing, the form of justice, then looking at the city, looking at the real thing, looking at the city, trying to make the city, the individual thing, the thing in the temporal world, as much as possible like the form of justice, just as the painter is, if he's a realist, is trying to make the painting as much like the actual object in the world as possible. That's the context of it. So Socrates says, at the bottom of page 200, next to 506a, that then is what every soul pursues, and for its sake does everything. The soul has a hunch that the good is something, but it is puzzled and cannot adequately grasp just what it is, or acquire the sort of stable belief about it that it has about other things. The good, why is knowledge and truth good, in a way, is the question there. So Socrates says at the top of page 201, anyway, I imagine that just and fine things won't have acquired much of a guardian in someone who does not even know why they are good. So he begins a discussion of the good, which is very difficult. And he asks Glaucon to think of the good, let's think of the good with a big G, as being like the sun, the analogy with the sun. We see things in the world, and there's the thing in the world, say this pair of scissors, and there's me, the knower. But Socrates says there has to be a third thing for me to see this pair of scissors, and that's light. Well, take that as a metaphor for intellectual knowledge. There has to be mind. There has to be something that the mind grasps. And there has to be something like the sun, that provides the medium, the light that illuminates the thing, and he calls that the good. Now this is really getting very abstract. But what he set up here is an analogy, again, between the grasping of intellectual things, like ideas, and the perception of physical things, like physical objects, like this. So we have two realms. Middle of page 202, next to number 10, the margin, Socrates says, and we say that the one class of things is visible but not intelligible. This is visible, that is seeable, sensible, but not intelligible. Intelligible meaning thinkable, part of an intellectual process. While the forms, remember the forms, are intelligible but not visible. Okay, so we've divided up sort of reality here in a familiar way between that which is visible but not thinkable, intelligible, and that which is thinkable, intelligible, without being visible. And those would be things that can only be grasped with the mind. And the discussion on pages 204 and 205, where we further delineate these two realms, results in something like a total representation of reality, the divided line, which is the last line that we'll be dealing with in this book, and deserves its own little talk on what the parts of the line are, what the line itself is supposed to represent, and finally how this divided line, which is a whole metaphysical inventory of what exists, how does it actually fit into the whole argument. And this will lead us into the very famous allegory of the cave at the beginning of Book 7, and a little bit about the further education of the philosopher guardian class, and then we'll more or less be done, and then we'll take some time to think about what Socrates has achieved in this book, and how much we agree with it, and whether he's really proved what he set out to prove.